Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. Our American friend TJ is back this week, and she's got a question. TJ?
Thanks, Dale. So, something caught my eye this week, which was that a court in Alberta wants to change its name to the Supreme Court, and I tried looking into it a bit and got completely lost in the weeds of the nomenclature for the court systems in Canada, so I would love some context on that, please.
Okay. This one kind of got my goat a little bit this week too, so I'm glad you asked about it. So in Canada, there are different levels in each province when it comes to courts. There are the provincial courts, which are the creatures of the provinces, and provinces nominate those judges. And then there's superior courts, which are creatures of the federal government, and for which the federal government nominates those judges. In Alberta, the superior court level is known as the Court of Queen's Bench, which is what they also call it in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Other provinces use different names for their superior court. Some of them call it the Superior Court of the province, and others call it the Supreme Court of the province. And that's where it gets confusing for everyone. In Alberta, they are talking about changing the name because in a few years, we will have the unfortunate incident of the demise of the crown, being when our beloved queen no longer is able to carry on in that role. I don't want to say what that means. And what will end up happening is they will have to change it to the Court of King's Bench at the time. But they wanted to kind of circumvent that whole thing and change the name entirely. And they want to use the Supreme Court name again in Alberta, which it actually used to be up until the 70s.
What prompted a shift to the Queen's Bench? Was that for all those three provinces? They all shifted in the 70s?
As far as I know, they did. And I'm not sure what the impetus was at the time. In the 70s, there was a lot of constitutional wrangling and negotiation and a lot of different experimentation in different parts of the country because we were all trying to come up with, new names and new things, and some of it worked and some of it didn't. I think Queen's Bench is a perfectly valid name, and I think it's a good one because it is indicative of the way in which Canada as a constitutional monarchy organizes ourselves, and the Queen is the font of justice. This is all stemming from those powers initially, so I think it's appropriate in that kind of a situation. Unfortunately, though, Supreme Court seems to make you think that it's the final level, but it's not, because superior courts get appealed to provincial courts of appeal, which then can get appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada. So that's where this confusion tends to come in, and that's why I think that provinces who use the Supreme Court name are just kind of asking for trouble. And I think if we were to standardize, my preference would be Queen's Bench, obviously, because I think that Canada as a constitutional monarchy should act like it. But if we were forced to, Superior Court is a much better name than Provincial Supreme Court. The only time that something gets appealed to a provincial superior court is a provincial court decision. But again, that's generally for smaller matters. So it's one extra step in that chain, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to call it a Supreme Court when it's, in most cases, a court of first instance.
So I'm going to be a bit meta for a moment. In order to legally change the name of their court, do they have to go to the federal court? How do they even make that happen?
It's provincial enabling legislation, actually.
Okay, so they don't have to go through a process of any kind of permission.
No.
From a federal level. Okay, that's very interesting. And it's interesting to hear the context of the original name changes because I think it reflects some of the fluidity that I see in the interpretation and application of government structures in Canada that is much more rigid in the States. And it might be a function of how old the country is as it's standalone, blah, 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 but
Right.
it's still fascinating. And in terms of the election, because in the States, obviously, we have this thing of who's appointed to the Supreme Court of the land, under which administration, has very far-reaching implications in general, and particularly in the U.S. for a lot of contemporary issues. Is there a similar situation here? Because if you're being appointed to a provincial court of appeals by a federal government, or what is the structure there?
So for superior courts and provincial courts of appeal, those are federal nominations, but they tend to go through a kind of a process. There are what they call judicial advisory committees, which collect names of people on the bar who are interested in becoming a judge, and they vet them, and they, there are a variety of different people on these advisory committees from various facets of the legal community who will kind of take the names and do a vetting process, which then gets submitted to the ministry. There is a judicial affairs advisor who will kind of go through the names that are brought to him or her to submit those to the minister, which then goes to the Prime Minister's office, because it is the Prime Minister and Cabinet who makes that decision, and they are politically accountable for those decisions. There was a bit of a story a few months ago about how the previous Justice Minister was resistant to sending these names, or some of the information with these names, to PMO because they were being vetted through a party database. People were like, well, are they just checking to see that they were party donors? It's not that at all. It's the fact that because they're politically accountable, these party databases have a trove of information that we don't really know what's all in it because they're exempt from privacy laws. So we can't tell what kind of information they've gathered, but it's reasonable to assume that they would have kinds of information in those databases that would be able to find red flags for these appointments. So it's important in that regard that there's that kind of level of, scrutiny, but also just awareness that because it's a federal appointment, there is political accountability for those appointments. When it comes to the Supreme Court level, again, they've created a kind of a process with a highly respected panel led by a former Prime Minister to go through applications and nominations for who would be suitable for that spot on the Supreme Court. Our Supreme Court has a quasi-regional quality to it. There are 3 seats reserved entirely for Quebec because Quebec has a separate legal system than the rest of Canada.
There are 3 seats for Quebec.
3 out of 9 are specifically for Quebec because Quebec has a civil law system, whereas the rest of Canada uses a common law system. And the other 6 have a sort of regional breakdown in terms of there's 3 for Ontario and 2 for the Prairie provinces and 1 for kind of the Atlantic provinces. So that kind of regional breakdown also is taken into account when it comes to Supreme Court nominations. But we've largely avoided doing any kind of ideological appointments to the Supreme Court. Part of that is also just a function of the Canadian legal system. We don't have a fairly ideological legal system in this country. There's not a lot of hardliners who are into things like originalism or whatever they call it in the States when it's, nothing, they read everything in terms of what the original framers in 1776 of the Constitution, how they would think of things, whereas in Canada we've largely adopted a living tree model, which means that as the meaning of things changes, so can what's the interpretation in the Constitution.
That is fascinating, and it's interesting. So, is this basically a combination of the seat allocation representing population density and such, combined with the distinction of the types of law in the provinces?
To a certain extent.
Yeah.
I mean, Ontario being the largest province, obviously, kind of is a bit of a center of gravity, and particularly in legal matters as well. And, the smaller provinces, again, regionally speaking, are smaller in population, so they're not attracting quite the same as much, population, but also as much jurisdiction or jurisprudence, I guess I'd say, in terms of what their courts decide. But BC has a fairly robust court system in terms of some of what it deals with, that kind of thing.
And just to throw a spanner in the works here.
For sure.
Tribunals.
Okay.
Where do they live in all of this? And full confession, I definitely tried to understand the flowchart on Wikipedia. And there's an entire line item in the Wikipedia section saying the nomenclature is confusing. So I felt a bit better after that.
Yeah.
Not much. So it would help if you contextualize tribunals for me in the middle of all of this.
Okay, so tribunals are quasi-judicial bodies. So they're not really courts, but they have some kind of legal capacity in terms of like labor relations, or Immigration and Refugee Board is a quasi-judicial body. So there are people who are essentially judges who are on these panels, but they're not actual judges. But what they decide does have the force of law. What tribunal decisions, when they get appealed, will generally go to either a superior court or a court of appeal, depending on where it lies. But they will generally go through what's called judicial review. So they will review the decision and see whether it was reasonable or appropriate based on the statutory, home for what that tribunal belongs to. That tribunal has to belong to a certain a law that it interprets, whether that's the Canada Labour Code or the Immigration and Refugee Act and so on. So they're responsible for that kind of decision making under that, so it's not all going to the court system.
So at the end of the day, all of this feeds to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Correct.
If something is going to go all the way, and the Supreme Court of Canada, with its decisions, are actually like completely sort of, it is the last.
That is the last.
Line.
Yeah.
It's not going like sort of lieutenant governor style,
No,
like to the Queen and back or anything.
No, the Supreme Court of Canada is the final court of appeal in Canada. Once upon a time, it used to be we did have the Supreme Court, but then there was still the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in England, which was still the highest level of appeal, but that is no longer the case. It's now entirely the Supreme Court of Canada.
Okay. Wow.
And I think the saying is that they're not last because they're right, but they're right because they're last.
Oh, that's very pithy. I'm a fan. Well, that helped a bit, actually, which I am surprised, because I thought I had no hope of sort of wrapping my mind around this. And it'd be interesting to see how this kind of stuff starts playing up leading up to the federal election. Because obviously, as I said, in the States, it's a huge political fodder as the discussions around this. But I have never really sort of kept a watch out for the discussions of court appointments and structures leading up to a Canadian election. So
one thing that might come up is the fact that this particular government was very slow to fill judicial appointments in a lot of cases, particularly under the previous Justice Minister. There was a lot of lag time in nominations, a lot of vacancies were on courts, and that created court delays. And when the Supreme Court of Canada put a mandatory cap on how long court delays could be before a case was dismissed, that caused a few high-profile cases to be tossed out, and people got very upset about that. And so that could be something that factors into the election.
Ah, interesting. And now I'm curious about what those cases were, but we will save that for another day.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at Journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.